with the official announcement of the Trey Lance experiment being a complete, absolute failure, I thought I would cover the 5 worst trades in the history of the NFL. And while the order may be a bit subjective, I think it's pretty undeniable that each and every one of these trades I mentioned are absolutely terrible for one team and absolutely amazing for the other. To start it off, the 5th worst trade in the history of the NFL was the RG3 trade. So if you can bring your mind all the way back to 2012, the Rams had the 2nd overall pick and the Washington football team had the 6th overall pick, but they really needed a quarterback and the Rams did not. So they put together a trade package that was 3 first-round picks and a second-round pick to move up to the number 2 spot. To start off Robert Griffin III's career, everyone knows he was really good his rookie season. He was looking like he could be a promising young quarterback on par with Andrew Luck, who was drafted right before him, but then he had an injury. And quite famously, the Washington football team urged him back too soon, and he fought through it to play in the playoffs, but unfortunately, he got even more injured and he never recovered. He was still the starter over the next few years in 2013 and 2014, but since he wasn't the same and he was really such a dual threat quarterback who relied on his legs, not being able to run as much, really destroyed his game, and to make it even worse, this made the football team very bad. This led to the 2nd first-round pick that the football team was giving up being the 22nd pick when they made it to the playoffs, but the 3rd and final first-round pick they gave up was the number 2 overall pick. So the football team ended up trading a 6th overall pick, a 45th overall pick one year, then a 22nd overall pick another year, and then finally a 2nd overall pick the final year. And to make it even worse, with the quarterback getting injured and not being able to play anymore, they essentially gave up all of this for nothing. The 4th worst trade in the history of the NFL is the Randy Moss trade. Now, I know he got traded all over the place a little bit, so to be more specific, the trade from the Oakland Raiders to the New England Patriots. In 2006, Randy Moss was on the Raiders, and he honestly was not good. His heart wasn't in it. He didn't want to be there. He ended up playing in 13 games, and he had 500 yards and 3 touchdowns, which is fine for like a 4th wide receiver, but for Randy Moss, one of the greatest of all time, it is not okay. So the Raiders thought, Randy Moss is pretty much done. Let's see if we can get anything for him, and they ended up getting a 4th round pick for him. However, the 4th round pick was probably not as high as they were hoping, because the first year the Patriots got him was 2007, and this was when they went undefeated through the regular season. Now, of course, they didn't win the Super Bowl, but I'd say going 18-1 is pretty good. And his stats are some of the best a wide receiver has ever had. He had almost 1,500 yards and 23 touchdowns. And in this year, he had 8 games of 100 or more receiving yards. The 3rd worst trade was the Ryan Leaf trade. So going back to 1998, there was a heated debate of who the best quarterback in the draft is. Ryan Leaf, everybody loved him, or this other guy named Peyton Manning, you might have heard of him. And of course, the Colts' number 1 pick ended up making the right choice with Peyton Manning. However, everyone thought Ryan Leaf was just as good of a prospect, if not even better. So the Chargers traded from the 3rd overall pick to the 2nd overall pick in order to get him. And in this trade, they gave up the number 3 overall pick, their 2nd round pick, so it's the 33rd pick, and then the next year's 1st. And you may think, oh, that's not that bad. Only a 2nd and an additional 1st to move up to the number 2 overall pick. It doesn't sound that bad. But you just have to look at how bad Ryan Leaf was. Ryan Leaf had multiple issues. The first is that he was terrible at being a quarterback in the NFL. His record in the NFL was just 4-21, and he threw 14 touchdowns and 36 interceptions. Now, not all of this is just because he wasn't talented at all. A large part was because he was a drug addict and he had some injuries. But being a drug addict and his total mentality towards the game and constantly getting in trouble just ruined him. And this led to his career being over after just 4 seasons. However, in these 4 seasons, and between being injured and suspended, he only played in 25 games out of 64. So not only was he bad when he played, but he hardly ever played. The second worst trade is probably what you came to this video for. It is the Trey Lance trade. So looking back, it was terrible. Like, there's no other way around it. He hardly ever played, and they gave up a lot. So the 49ers ended up trading 3 first-round picks and a third-round pick to move up to the number 3 overall pick and to take Trey Lance in 2021. Now, at the time, it was seen as pretty steep, especially since Trey Lance was a project player, but everyone believed in the 49ers because they've built a very solid team, so we thought maybe it will work out. Now, it has sort of worked out for the 49ers with Brock Purdy, but this one has not. I mean, Trey Lance has played in hardly any games at all. On the other hand, the Dolphins were able to use these picks to get Tyreek Hill, Bradley Chubb, and Jalen Waddle, who are 3 potential all-pro players that have loaded up the Dolphins organization and has let the Dolphins have the craziest wide receiver duo in the NFL. But it was a bit of a sad experiment, especially for Trey Lance, because he came in super raw, hardly playing at all in college, and the same thing happened in the NFL. He only had 3 games in the NFL where he had more than 20 pass attempts. And his first year in 2021, Garoppolo was the starter and he was just the backup. He was learning. We were all kind of okay with it. We all kind of expected it. And then 2022, last year, was Trey Lance's time. He had spent a year on the bench, and this was his time to shine. He played 1 game in a monsoon against the Bears, like craziest winds and rain ever. And he lost, and he, if you look at the stats are bad. But it's not his fault. Nobody could have thrown the ball there, and it's not even a real game. And then in his second game in 2022, he gets 3 passes off, and then he breaks his ankle and is out for the year. Then when he's gone, Brock Purdy, the 49ers 7th round pick, explodes, does great, leads the 49ers to the NFC Championship game, and Trey Lance is just left on the bench waiting. Now come to the offseason of this year, and there's a competition between Trey Lance and Sam Darnold for who will be the backup quarterback, and Trey Lance loses. So it might be a combination of him getting hurt, and honestly, he just might not be that good. I don't really blame him because he hasn't really had any starting time, and he just hasn't played very much football, especially compared to all of these other people. Since he's clearly not what the 49ers had hoped for, the 49ers ended up trading him to the Cowboys for a 4th round pick, and honestly, everybody's kind of freaking out over the 4th round pick being more than they thought the 49ers could get. And if you add up all of Trey Lance's stats with the 49ers, he only has 102 pass attempts. So it took him 102 pass attempts to realize that he's not their guy. And you have to think, what would the 49ers be like if they didn't make this trade? Now, maybe they don't get Brock Purdy. Let's say they just keep Jimmy Garoppolo and all these draft picks. They clearly can draft well since the rest of the team is loaded. And they could have won the Super Bowl potentially. If they had a good quarterback, now you can't deal with injuries, but if they had a good quarterback, they could have competed with the Eagles this year or the previous year. And then before I get to the worst trade ever, I do want to have a special mention that some people include as one of the worst trades ever, but I don't. And that is the Ricky Williams situation. So if you don't know about it, in 1999, the Saints traded quite literally their entire draft as well as a 1st and a 3rd the next year in order to draft Ricky Williams a star running back. And in Ricky Williams' time with the Saints, he was good, but not exactly all that they had hoped. He did run for over 1,000 yards in 2 of his 3 seasons, but he had a lot of time off the field, and the Saints essentially were thinking, hey, if we can trade him now, we will, because we regret giving up over an entire draft worth of draft capital for this running back. So luckily, back then, they could. And after his 3rd season in the NFL concluded, the Saints were able to trade him to the Dolphins for 4 draft picks, including 2 first-round picks. And then when he was with the Dolphins, Ricky Williams was amazing. He had some great years, but he ran into a similar problem of getting suspended because he just kept on smoking weed and just wouldn't stop. He doesn't care if the NFL suspends him or what. He wouldn't stop, and he even retired for a while from the NFL, essentially because he wouldn't stop smoking weed. And the reason why I'm not going to include this on one of the worst trades ever is, one, because the Saints were able to trade him for a lot, so they recouped a large majority of their investment. They only traded away 2 first-round picks, and they got back 2 first-round picks. So I then can't call it a terrible trade. But it is unique enough to be included in this. And I also can't include it as one of the worst trades ever because of just how talented and good Ricky Williams was for a few years. And then before I get to the worst trade ever, please like and subscribe to my channel if you've enjoyed the video and have made it this far. But the worst trade ever is the Herschel Walker trade, of course. Now, if you haven't heard of it, it is very interesting. So at the time of the deal in 1989, between the Cowboys and the Vikings were a really good team. The Cowboys were a terrible team. So the Cowboys had a really good running back, Herschel Walker, all-time great, especially in college. He's just a great running back. The Cowboys go, hey, I'll trade him to whoever is interested. And of course, lots of teams around the league were interested. So this drove up the price, and the Vikings offered a very interesting trade, and honestly, they got completely duped. What the Vikings thought they were doing was giving up 4 solid players and a 1st-round pick, a 2nd-round pick, and a 6th-round pick. However, there were some conditions, and the Cowboys kind of tricked them into giving them way more. There were conditions on each of these players where if the Cowboys were to cut them, then they would get a high draft pick from the Vikings. And if they ended up cutting all of the players, the Cowboys would end up getting 3 first-round picks, 3 second-round picks, and a 3rd-round pick. And the reason why the Vikings were okay with including these conditions as part of the trade were they were not thinking these players would just get cut. They were saying, hey, maybe if they get injured, you can cut them and you'll be safe. They thought it was kind of just smoothing out the deal with Dallas, and they would never have to worry about it. What ended up happening was Jimmy Johnson then cut Alex Stewart, a defensive end who was part of the deal. And in return for cutting him, they would get a 3rd-round pick. He then made it very clear by benching the remainder of the players and just flat out saying it that he was going to cut the remainder of these players and get all of these draft picks. This shocked the Vikings front office, and they weren't prepared for what to do. They didn't actually plan on losing all of their draft picks the next 3 years. But here they are. Then at the end of the year, Jimmy Johnson goes, actually, I kind of like some of these players. So what Jimmy Johnson then does is he calls the Vikings back. He says, hey, I'll give you 2 3rd-round picks and a 10th-round pick if I can keep the players and get all the draft picks I would have got from cutting them. And the Vikings accepted it because they just needed some draft capital at that point. So the Dallas Cowboys ended up getting all of those draft picks and to keep the players. And it made a dynasty for the Cowboys, and it really ruined the Vikings. So I hope you have enjoyed the video. Please leave a like, subscribe, comment, and yeah, maybe check out some of my other videos. Bye.